Hello everyone, this is Jody McRoberts of Pulaski KY Strong Towns, and this is another observation walk recap. This was an interesting walk I did because one of the members of our group is blind. Her name is Paula, and on August 9th I went to her house and did an observation walk with her on her street. She doesn't normally walk on her street alone because there's some safety issues there. She lives in a road that connects into downtown Somerset. That area of the road is basically all residential, and she's close to the yards there are larger, so she's close to the neighbor on her left, but the neighbor on her right, that house is quite a ways away. So I want to give you some history about Paula. So several years ago, she and her late husband were able to build a house that she lives in. They were told that they would be within walking distance of some things in downtown, such as the pharmacy, City Hall, and the Kentucky Career Center. But their house is actually over a mile from these places, and even sighted people might not want to walk that far. She said she would be willing to walk the distances if it was safe, but the sidewalks on her street really aren't suitable for her to walk on. She told me with a laugh, if I could walk to everything, I'd be in heaven. So she used to live in a larger city and was right down the street from a convenience store that has some food items, and she wasn't even that far from a grocery store, and she would walk there sometime soon. And in that city, she could even cross the street and get on a bus. And once before she and her late husband moved to Somerset, they were out for a walk and got lost. What happened was that there was an area of the sidewalk that got fixed so the texture of the sidewalk was different, and they got confused as they were using their cane because it felt different, and they passed by the place where they needed to turn. But they did find their way back. So this is, you can see that she's able to get around if things are laid out well. One thing she told me is that if people see blind people out walking alone, sometimes they get scared and they think, what are they doing out here all alone? Why don't they have someone to help them? It's not safe. But that's not always the case because there are places where blind people can get around safely. So I'm going to give you an overview of the walk we did. And one thing I want to mention before I give you that overview is we talked about the fact that infrastructure costs, that there's a maintenance, there's a big cost to it. That is, we talked about ways in which the sidewalk could be improved. And as we talked about that, we were very aware that it can take a lot of money to make those improvements, and the government entity that is responsible has to be able to build that into their budget. And in this case, the road that, even though it goes right into downtown Somerset, is actually, the road she lives on is actually maintained by the state of Kentucky. So here's some things that we observed as we walked. So the shoulders on her street are narrow, so as the cars drive by, they're very close to the sidewalk, and she said that could be dangerous if there's any veering out to the road for her. She'd be very close to the cars. And also the curb in some areas is only about 1.5 inches tall, and me as a sighted person, I think, well, that should be enough. But when she's using her cane, sometimes if the curb is shorter, it can be hard to distinguish between the road and the street. Now, in some places where that street was resurfaced, the asphalt is actually literally on top of the sidewalk. So the sidewalk is actually flush with the street in those areas, which could be really dangerous for blind people. There are also 2 places where the sidewalk had been dug up and they were about 18 inches wide. And instead of putting concrete back in there were metal grates to fill the gaps. And Paula was mentioned that could be difficult for people who have balance issues because of that different texture there. And we talked about that maybe the state of Kentucky chose to put grates in there because maybe it was cheaper than refilling it with concrete. And there was one place where the sidewalk was repaired. It was kind of sloped up in that area, where the new concrete was poured, where it met the old concrete. It wasn't a smooth transition. And she mentioned if someone had balance issues or an injured leg, it could be difficult and it could be a tripping hazard. And I was thinking, even for sighted people, we might trip over. And I've done that on sidewalks before, so you can imagine how much more difficult it would be for a blind person. There's one place where the sidewalk tile, the one right after, was just a little bit farther down, so it was taller. The one she was on was taller than the next one, and she thought she was entering a street. So you can see how tricky that is as you're walking along those little cues that it'd be difficult for blind people that we sighted people wouldn't think about. And one final note, that wasn't not something so much you could really make many changes to as far as the infrastructure, but there was a place where the sidewalk is sloped down, the yard sloped down a ways from the sidewalk. So even though there's not really much you could do with the sidewalk probably to change that, it's just a note, something to make note of for blind people. That can be really tricky. And then we actually crossed an intersection. So we came to an intersection, and the interesting thing, Paula shared to me how she uses her sense of hearing when she's in intersections. So if she was facing, her right side was facing the street. So as she was listening, She was watching for the sound of if she something when going by her right ear, she knew, okay, that's cars on the road, that's fine, I have to be concerned. But then she used her left ear, and as she was listening, if she could tell the sound was coming toward her, like it was going to go across her, she knew, okay, that's a car coming, it's going to cross where I'm going to be walking, so I have to wait until we don't hear that sound anymore. And she was like, okay, it sounds clear, we can go. And so we actually crossed the street. Now at that intersection, the height of the curb gradually decreased until it was flush with the street so that wheelchairs, strollers, etc. would have a much easier time crossing. And as we crossed, there were textured bricks to the point where the sloping curb met the street. And Paula said if it weren't for those, she wouldn't have known she was back on the sidewalk because she didn't feel an incline. The interesting thing is, you know, as you go up, if you have one of those sloping curves, you do gradually go up. But that place in the road, it was actually going downhill a bit. So that was throwing her off a bit. She wasn't aware that she was actually coming back onto the sidewalk. So we discussed that the sloping sidewalk, obviously it's great for people, you know, with wheelchairs, strollers, etc. But it's interesting to see how with blind people, that was actually a bit trickier for her. So just something to think about as we are serving people with disabilities. One thing may be great for somebody else and it may be more tricky for other people. So as far as transportation, what Paula uses, she uses RTEC, and she uses ride shares, and also she gets rides from people. One thing she did note that living in a smaller town is nice. It seems like people are more willing to give her rides. She would also like to use the bus again. She enjoys going to bus stops, and if there was an opportunity for her to use a train system, she would be willing to learn how to use it. So the things that she would like to see, she said it'd be great to get people on board to fix these things in her sidewalk. And she talked about how great it would be if there was a little store near to her. And we talked about the fact that a lot of times zoning doesn't allow for, you know, commercial and retail in areas where there's just residential. And if there's ever a possibility where there can be flexibility in zoning to allow for those things, that would be really great. So thanks so much for watching this. I hope it was helpful to you to get some insight on what it's like for a blind person to be able to get around their city.